and our city is in the greatest danger that it has ever been in its history. The reason is that we have gotten away from the Bible of our forefathers. You see, the right of segregation, The right of segregation is clearly established by the Holy Scriptures, both by precept and example.
1 minute.
I'm sorry, I brought the wrong notes with me this evening. I borrowed my argument from the wrong century. It turns out what I've been reading to you this whole time are direct quotes from white preachers from the 1950s and the 1960s, all in support of racial segregation. All I have done is simply take out the phrase racial integration and substituted it with the phrase gay rights.
So again, that was Reverend Snider. He makes comparisons between segregation in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s to the LGBT movement that is going on now and the issues that surround the LGBT community. Beginning with the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement brought pivotal changes to the American social structures. The goals were to bring equality to Black Americans and other minorities that had previously been lacking. A few of the milestones that were reached during the civil rights movement include the case of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which established that Jim Crow laws of separate but equal schooling were unconstitutional, and that began the desegregation of schools. There was also the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of. That act outlawed the discrimination against people based on race, religion, sex, and national origin. Some of the reasons for the civil rights movement included rights that were restricted for minority groups, including voting. The voting became legal for different minority groups at different times in different states. But even when voting was, even when the discrimination, again, I don't know how to put it. Even when voting did become legal, there was other obstacles such as literacy tests that were put in place to prevent minorities from being able to actually vote. They had to pass written and reading tests in order to vote, and they couldn't read or write because they were never offered a proper education. They were also denied owning property, which is how a family would establish themselves back in the 50s and 60s. And minorities also faced a lot of discrimination for equal opportunities, including education. It was not comparable to those of their white counterparts. Job opportunities, which would allow Blacks more diversified skills, were held against them. And when it comes to treatment, legal treatment of minorities, any minority that was accused of a crime was essentially found guilty regardless of how much evidence they had against them. It wasn't until 1967 that the Supreme Court ruled that prohibiting interracial marriage was unconstitutional in the case of Loving versus Virginia. I'm going to talk about the Jim Crow laws a little bit for a second. The Jim Crow laws enforced segregation and the idea of separate but equal. This reinforced segregated schools, leaving minority children to walk miles and miles in harsh conditions to get to their schools, while whites had closer schools and had buses that could pick them up. Jim Crow laws also regulated public transportation like buses, where Blacks would sit in the back of buses and whites would sit at the front, unless the scenario arose where there was not enough seats for whites, in which case the white people could ask Blacks or other minorities to get up out of their seats to offer it to the white person. Businesses were also segregated, and owners of stores could freely deny services to any and all Blacks or other minorities. Police brutality was at an all-time high in the 60s. Police were given great amounts of discretion within their authority, which would lead to unnecessary beatings, the use of tear gas on protesters, regardless of whether they were violent or not, and the iconic image of high-pressure water hoses used to knock minorities to their knees. Violence did not just come from police officers back then. The public would form lynching mobs and beating crews that would beat minorities, sometimes to death, mercilessly, such as the case of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy who allegedly flirted with a white woman, who was then beaten and tortured to death and thrown in a river. So when we talk about minority groups, a lot of times the groups that come to mind are blacks, Hispanics, stuff like that. But minorities really include any group that is less powerful than the dominant group. In the 1950s and 60s, there were lots of groups addressed, such as race and religion, but one group that got overlooked a lot was the LGBT community. LGBT stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. Well, that's the initials of LGBT. LGBT has really become a catch-all phrase for any person of different levels of transgress, which pretty much means any person that doesn't fit the social norm of what a woman should be or what a man should be. They fit inside of the LGBT community. There's still a lot of debate on what this movement should even be called. Should it be LGBT? Should it be something else? Other taglines you might hear are LGBTQ or LGBTQA. LGBTQA stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and allies. So that includes their straight counterparts that are also in support of them. Some of the goals of the LGBT movement are to reduce suicide rates among the LGBT community. Suicide is the third leading cause of death among young people. The suicide results in 4,400 deaths of young people per year. About 30% of these deaths come from the LGBT community or people relating with sexual identity crises. This is an extremely unproportional amount of people, considering that the LGBT community makes up only 10% of the American population. The LGBT movement also strives to reduce public violence. The case of Matthew Shepard is a primary example of violence against gays. He was a 21-year-old gay man who was tortured and beaten. He was tied to a wooden fence post and left to die. He was found alive days later, was taken to a hospital, and died of brain injuries 6 days after his original disappearance. The LGBT movement strives for marriage equality, which means they want equal treatment when it comes to marriage. They want the same tax breaks that a straight couple would get. They want to be able to visit their partner in the hospital if they are ill. They want to be able to adopt children and have custody of each other's children. And they want appropriate inheritance to apply to them and their family. The LGBT community also strives to address police misconduct, which is often overlooked. In the past, evidence has been fabricated against gays by police officers for a series of crimes, primarily consisting of traffic violations. Both of these groups have a lot in common, but they also have several differences, as you can imagine. Both of these groups have been victims of police brutality, public violence, public shaming and bullying, and legal restrictions enforced against them for varying reasons, such as marriage and the use of public restrooms. The differences between these two movements really focuses, one of the big reasons that it's different is that blacks are easily identifiable by distinguishing features that they cannot change about themselves, and this includes other racial minorities and sometimes religious minorities as well. So that's one big difference. Another huge difference is that back then there wasn't social media, so bullying happened in person and up front, but now bullying can happen anonymously online. And bullying is a lot of what leads to these high death rate statistics of suicides. Another huge factor is that the LGBT community has benefited from all of the won battles from the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement really had to lay down the foundation for all of the other minority groups that were to follow them. So the LGBT community kind of has a running start. Another huge difference, probably the differences that come most to mind, are that back in the 50s and 60s, the way we promoted change was through marches to Washington, sit-ins in restaurants, and boycotts of products of people that were not supporting the cause. Today we don't see a whole lot of that. Instead, we see pride parades and courtroom challenges, legal debates to really try to forge change. So that's a huge difference. As Dr. Bain said, this is a sociological theory class, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the theories of social change. Symbolic interaction theory in general is about people's ideas and thoughts and how they are shaped by the interactions they have with people in their close proximity or their in-groups, if you will. Social construct theory is a branch of symbolic interaction theory which focuses on how people form ideas about the world. These ideas are not necessarily correct or incorrect, they are just the perceptions of the world from that group's point of view. The group defines what they perceive to be good or bad, correct or incorrect, good or right and wrong. The group doesn't always sit down and take a vote to establish which action is correct and which action is incorrect. They just pretty much develop a set of principles to which they live by and govern their actions. Different groups will perceive different things as good or bad, and whatever conclusion they come to becomes their own personal reality. Applying social construct theory to both of these movements, while slavery was once really normal for the American culture, we would all be pretty appalled at the idea of owning another person in today's society. This really shows how much the ideologies of a single group can change. When these new ideas and constructs become a reality, new rules must be put in place to move from one mindset to the next. This is often met with conflict and resistance. Social evolution theory examines the process of social change. Cultures change and must evolve to accommodate these changes. This means that there is an amount of flexibility in the overall structure of the group. These changes are influenced by new discoveries and new technologies that were not previously available to themselves. Social movement theory branches off of social evolution theory because it is the theory that focuses on cultural impacts on social movements. As social evolution theory suggests, over time cultures shift from one point of view to another. As viewpoints shift, so do the ways in which people lobby for change. Rodney Stark created a model for social change, and it's one that really helps examine the civil rights movement and the LGBT movements side by side. Stark believed that in order for social change to be necessary, there must be common grievances, there must be things that people agree are wrong. Large groups of people must agree that these things are wrong and need to change. These groups must have hope that if they do something about it now, that there actually could be a chance to change what's wrong. No one wants to put their neck on the line if they don't believe that there is any hope that there will change. They'll pretty much just sit in the corner until they find that moment when they believe it'll work. They need a precipitating event that ignites the desire to make the change happen right now. In the Civil Rights Movement, one of those precipitating events would be Rosa Parks. Many, many people refused to give up their seats on buses before Rosa Parks did, but for some reason, that's the one that clicked. That one happened. Rosa Parks, an elderly black woman, refused to give up her seat to a white man, and at that point in time, people were like, no, it's wrong. It had been wrong before then, but that was the precipitating moment that people decided now is the time for it to change. And Stark also believed in the ability to recruit followers. After all, no one can really win a war by themselves. They kind of need people on their side backing them up in order to really accomplish what they set out to accomplish. Stark also says that in order for social change to be successful, it needs to be able to mobilize its resources. It must have access to resources that will support and organize the efforts of the group, such as news, time, money, and effective leadership. They also need the ability to withstand opposition because, of course, if you are planning on changing all of the ideas that you have been going by for so long, there are going to be people that are opposed, and you can't just say, oh, okay, you're against me, that's fine, never mind, I'll just stop. You have to really be able to stick together as a group to fight for that change. You also need external allies. This is, in my opinion, one of the most important parts because when it comes to these social changes, they occur when a less powerful group is trying to create equality for themselves, and them being the less powerful group, they need people in the dominant group to help support them and back them up in order for the success of the change. If they don't have anyone else outside of that minority group, they don't have a whole lot of a chance. They also need separate organizations working together for a common goal. This is important because they can tackle issues from different sides, different points of views, and put different pressures on the situation to create change. So the way we apply this theory to the Civil Rights Movement and to the LGBT movement today, when you're looking at the Civil Rights Movement, they had grievances. There was unequal treatment. There's vast amounts of inequality. They didn't have equal schools, the Jim Crow laws, as I mentioned before. They began to have hope in the late 50s for this to change. It had been a problem before the 50s, but in the 50s they really saw a chance to move in and make a change in their lives and to really reformat kind of what the laws would look like in regards to the minority communities. The precipitating event, as I mentioned earlier, one of them would be the situation with Rosa Parks. They had followers of all different kinds. They had blacks, Hispanics, Asians, all the different minority groups banding together, which was really great. And then they also had their white counterparts, not all of them, obviously, most of them are not, but they had several white counterparts, including really important leaders that were on their side pushing for change as well. Some of these allies include President Johnson and several judges that passed the changes over time. When they mobilized, they did marches, sit-ins, boycotts. They really needed to get the attention of the people and say, you know, this isn't right, you're going to hear me, you're going to see what I have to say, you're not going to just run us over anymore. There were different leaders involved, such as MLK and Malcolm X. When it comes to the LGBT community, their grievances are somewhat similar. They have unequal treatment, they want marriage equality, they want to have all the same rights as their straight counterparts do. One of the precipitating events of the LGBT movement was the Stonewall Inn in New York City. This event actually occurred in 1969. It's when police targeted an illegal gay bar. They pretty much smashed in the doors and would beat to death anyone in the club or forcibly remove them from the club. So that was how it really first started. And then there are events like the death of Matthew Shepard that really reignite that original fire to keep it going and keep it alive. They also have followers of all kinds, including powerful political leaders 1969. It's been happening for decades and they're still fighting, so they have withstood opposition so far. They are allies with both their groups and with straight couples and people. One very notable difference, though, is that at least with the research I've done thus far and what I know about the LGBT movement, I don't know of any specific leaders that have really propelled the movement. And there have certainly been lots of significant people involved, but not necessarily like a face of LGBT, which is interesting. I don't know if any of y'all have ideas on who could kind of be in those shoes, but that's where I'm at right now with this research. As I mentioned before, protests look really different now than they used to. In the 50s, we had the marches, sit-ins, and boycotts, and you don't see any of that happening really. But in the 50s, you have to remember, it was a lot more difficult to connect with people. We didn't have the technologies that we have today. We couldn't just pick up the phone and say, hey, we're going to go meet and make this happen. It was, you went and knocked on doors and you said, we're going to Washington. They're going to hear us. We're going to go. And they would do that. And the only way to send a message to a business was to say, no, we're not going to do this with you anymore. If you don't support what we support, then we're going to boycott you. In today's world, we have instant connection, and you can do a pride parade in your own hometown, not have to go and leave your job for however long it would take to march to Washington, have it videotaped, put it on the news, and then whoever is the president at the time can still see it, which is really cool because you can do the same thing without doing the same thing. So to kind of wrap this up, symbolic interactionism and social evolution are theories that can be applied over time. While they cannot predict the changes of the future, they can predict that the future will change. When, how, and why are questions for future sociologists to study. There is a questions and answer portion of this presentation, but before we get there, I really want to tell you why I care about this and why I feel like everyone else should care about it as well. When it comes to the social ladder, as any ladder, there's a top and there's a bottom. And the ladder's never going to be laying down flat. There will always be a top and a bottom. Whether it was with the civil rights movement in minorities or with women, when it was World War II and there was, we kind of put Japanese civilians in camps, even though they didn't do anything wrong. The LGBT community, there are always people of lesser power and people with more power. We have the civil rights with Emmett Till, we have Matthew Shepard's death, and all of the other casualties that come with both of these movements. So one of the real questions is, who comes after the LGBT community? Who's going to take their place in the bottom part of that social ladder? And what do we do about it? How do we address that? How do we try to prevent it from happening? So that's what I got so far. If you have questions, I would love to attempt to answer them for you. I can't promise anything, but I want to kind of have a dialogue, and that's my goal. So thank you very much. Dr. Sita?
Oh, thank you. I'm wondering if the reason there isn't the leaders emerging, because as you said, for African American, the ticket to admission to that group was skin color. For this particular minority group, a lesbian leader could not necessarily represent a transgender because they wouldn't be perceived as the same in-group.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that might be what's going on? And also, how does that strengthen or weaken their ability to address cultural change?
I would imagine that has a huge part of it. The LGBT community has so many different parts of it. It's not, when you think about gender in this sense, it's really more of a sliding scale. You have women on one side and men on the other side. face fully, and then you have like a sliding scale in between of people that are lesbian, gay, whatever you want to call them, and then all the people that don't have labels too, that are kind of just somewhere muddled up in between, that don't have that specific identity. So I can see how having one specific leader would be difficult because they really couldn't represent everybody. And then transgenders face completely different sets of problems that the gay community does because they just aren't the same people. So I can imagine that has a lot of problems. I don't think it's necessarily hurting them though. I know in Stark's model it was really important to have specific leaders, but I think the community has been the face of LGBT. So I think that in a way does not hurt them. It's just they're saying, you know, we are us. We're not a person. We're us. You need to accept us as we are. So I don't think it's necessarily hurting their cause.
I was just thinking out loud, I'm intrigued when you talk about the allies and how, to me at least, remarkable is a signal of the question, to watch as professional athletes have come out and see organized Major League Baseball and National Football League specifically coming out in their defense. And, the state of Arizona sort of rolling over because of economic threats from these long-term organizations. So just another pretty powerful difference. I don't know what parallels you can draw between those people with Jackie Robinson breaking that code on them, but some other areas for exploration, so we suggest themselves there.
I agree. I don't know what to say in response.
I
agree.
mean, what the
I
question
just agree.
I was thinking this, I was just thinking allies and how unusual it is to see the NFL and Major League Baseball coming off in support of the LGBT community. That's a fairly remarkable change that indicates a lot more change coming in the very near future.
And I think it's really great for them to add the QA at the end of LGBT because by saying LGBT, you get a large group of people, but then you ostracize a little bit the larger group of straight people. Like the presentation said, the LGBT community make up 10%. That means if you leave out everyone else, that's 90% of the people that you're saying, no, you don't get to be a part of us. But by saying, yes, we're going to be friends, we're going to be allies in this, and really including the straight community as well, I think that helps their cause a lot by not ostracizing anyone, trying to say, we're not trying to take your place, we're trying to be your friend. So that's kind of cool. Anyone else have thoughts?
I do. I'm a little conflicted
Mm-hmm.
between the civil rights movement and the information age as was then, and the LGBT with the information information world as is now. When they marched on Washington, they sacrificed. The sacrifice was clear and compelling and inspiring, but they had to give quite a bit of their life to do that. These days, you can film a video, put it on YouTube. To me, it's almost equivalent with Mardi Gras. You know, it's a party, not to be taken seriously, and it's easy. And it's not only easy to put out there, but it's easy for it to get lost in an ocean of information that there's just not enough time to process. So, the demonstration of the commitment I don't see there right now, but that's just my perspective.
I agree. Actually, the kernel of this project started, the idea I had for this project was really, I guess when I pitched it, I said, Americans are kind of lazy now. They don't do what we used to do. It bothers me. That's where I started with the research, and I really felt as though